this session, which is going to look at resumes and cover letters. And this session is going to be delivered by Renee Solomon, and Renee is one of the project officers with the Eye to the Future project. And Renee has a special guest with her today, which is Lisa Tricarico. I hope I pronounced your name right, Lisa. Lisa is the Manager of Human Resources with the Yoorrook Justice Commission, and she's recently completed her MBA with La Trobe University. Lisa has worked in human resources and operations for the past 20 years, and her career has focused on organisational strategy, values-based cultures, and diversity across the not-for-profit and commercial sectors. Lisa believes organisational culture and positive engaged workforces are the foundation of successful organisations, and I completely agree with that statement. Over the years, Lisa has interviewed hundreds of candidates and reviewed many more resumes, and hopes that she can share some insights with you all today that will be useful in the job search. So Lisa, thank you very much for joining us, and I hand over to you, Renee and Lisa.
Thank you, Nicole, and welcome, Lisa, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. Firstly, I'd just really like to thank Lisa for affording us her time and expertise today. And for everyone that's here, when it comes to resume and cover letter writing, there's quite a lot of information. So just reminding you all that today's session is being recorded, so you don't have to hurriedly type in notes to keep. You can actually refer back to this recording through our website at aneyetothefuture.org.au. So today I will start by having a chat about cover letters. As most of you are probably aware, generally when we apply for a position these days, there's a cover letter and a resume involved in that application. So for those that maybe haven't written a cover letter before, I think the question is generally, why do we need one? Because everything's in our resume. The purpose really of a cover letter is for HR staff or recruiters to get a succinct and short and direct to the point message about why you're suitable for the role, and also why you're interested in the role. So whilst your resume is a very in-depth view of all of your skills, work history and education, the cover letter is really drawn down to what skill sets you have that are transferable to that specific role. So it gives the recruiter, the option to have a very quick snapshot at why you're suitable for the position. When it comes to writing your cover letter, my first advice would be to prepare yourself first. So reading the job advertisement several times and really getting a good understanding of what the expectations are, what the language is that's used in that advertisement, and understanding that using similar language or replicating the language from the criteria for that position into your cover letter is quite important, because a lot of organisations these days use like a tracking software to scan and filter applicant cover letters. So if you're using language from the advertisement, you're more likely to not be screened and let go of before you get the chance for an interview. So for instance, if it's a secretarial role, the selection criteria may use language like administration or record management or petty cash. So if that's in the selection criteria, it's always good to try and replicate that language into your cover letter. It's a good idea to research the organisation, whether it's via its website or people that you may know that work there, to get a good understanding of the organisation's purpose, what they actually do, what the culture's like, so that you can incorporate that kind of language into your cover letter. Also, always note the closing date so that you're submitting your application on time. This is also really important for online applications, particularly these days. Quite a lot of the online platforms for applying for a role have their own specific requirements on top of a cover letter or your resume. So generally what they will allow you to do is enter information, save it and come back to it. So it's always a good idea that if you're applying for something online, to start that application process really early, so you can really put some time into thinking about what you're going to say, what information you'll provide. You can save it, go back, change it later if you think of new ideas. So always best not to leave it until the closing date to submit your application. Start it as early as you can and put some time and effort into the information that you provide. When it comes to your cover letter, it's extremely important to pay very close attention to the selection criteria in the job advertisement, because this is the purpose of your cover letter, is to cover the essential job criteria and let the employer know, as again, at a quick glance, what qualifications that you have, what experience you have that covers that selection criteria. If there's essential criteria that you don't meet, for example, particularly in this space, it might be something like requiring a driver's license. And I can say that in my own personal experience, that particularly with larger organisations, quite often in their job advertisements and their selection criteria, they have standardised criteria, like, for instance, having a driver's license. But the reality is not all of those positions will actually require that. It's just standard language they use in everything. So if you find a role that you're really interested in, that you believe that you have the experience and skill set to fulfill that role, but it has something like having a driver's license in it, there's no reason to choose not to apply. The stupidest question is the one you don't ask. So I would always encourage people to call the employer, call the recruitment agent, and get a little bit more information around whether that is actually a requirement of the role. However, you must consider that that may open you up to the possibility of having to share your disability status. So whether or not you are comfortable with doing that is up to you, and we will certainly cover disclosure in our coming up workshop. But when it comes to a role, particularly in the blindness and vision impairment space, there may be some criteria that you think makes you ineligible for the job. But if it's something that you love to do and that you believe that you're skilled at doing and a role that you can fulfill, I would always encourage you to call the employer or the recruitment agent and have a discussion around whether or how specific those criteria are. Once you've got a good handle on the culture of the organisation, what they do, what the job involves, what kind of language you need to use in your cover letter, then you can start drafting your cover letter. And as the name suggests, a cover letter is a letter, and it should be formatted as one. So we don't start a cover letter with a title that says cover letter. It's written as a cover letter. Everything should be left aligned. The very first thing on the page should be the name of the person that you're contacting, their role, the organisation, and then followed by the reason that you're contacting them, which would be a reference to the name of the position that you're applying for. After that, when it comes to the dear this person, dear that, where possible, if the name of the recruiter or the HR person in the organisation is available in the advertisement, do use their name. Try to steer clear from to who it may concern or dear sir or madam. It's best to try and personalise your cover letter as much as possible. Your cover letter and your resume are two standalone documents. So what you don't want is to replicate language from your resume into your cover letter. Your cover letter is all about why you want to work at that organisation. And it's basically a marketing piece to sell yourself to the recruiter. So you really want to keep it very specific to that role. So where your resume is very much your entire skill set, your entire job history, all of your achievements, the cover letter is very specific to the role. So you really just want to sell yourself, why you'd love to work there, why you would be beneficial to the organisation in that position, and then covering off your skill set to cover the criteria for that position. So I would generally suggest starting your cover letter with a short paragraph that introduces yourself and why you're suitable and interested in the role. So for an example, if you're applying for a secretarial position, you might start your cover letter with a short paragraph that says something along the lines of, as a highly skilled administration professional, I'd like to express my interest in the personal assistant position available at your organisation. With significant experience in a similar role at a large firm, I believe I would make a valuable contribution to your team. Having said that, this opening statement really needs to avoid very generic language, which we see so often in resumes and cover letters. Things like, I'm highly motivated, I'm passionate, I'm hardworking. Anybody can say these things about themselves, and it really means nothing to a recruiter. There's no evidence to support those claims about yourself. So in your opening statement, make sure that it's specific to what you can evidence in your resume. So if you're going to say things that like you're a highly skilled administration professional with significant experience in this similar role, etc., your resume then needs to back that and evidence that claim. So do try to avoid generic language that anybody can say about themselves. It really it doesn't mean anything, and it's wasted space on your cover letter. Your cover letter should explain briefly how you match the job description. So every single area of the selection criteria in the advertisement must be covered in your cover letter. So for instance, if one of the selection criteria is for an administration role, directing incoming phone calls, give an example of your experience doing this that then ties to your employment history in your resume. And also try and use the same language that's used in the advertisement. So for instance, it might read something, if the selection criteria says directing incoming phone calls, your response to that in your cover letter may read something along the lines of, in my previous role, I directed incoming phone calls to a staff body of 30 people. So again, notice the use of that replicated language from the advertisement. It's general practice to end your cover letter with thanking the advertiser for the opportunity to apply and to explore your resume for specific information about your skills and experience, which will obviously be attached after the cover letter. It's always a good idea, particularly if you're applying for multiple positions at once, to make sure that you save your cover letter under the name of the organisation or the job role that you're applying for. So if you are lucky enough to be granted an interview, you can easily track back to that cover letter and see what the role's all about and how you responded to that selection criteria. Now, these days, opposed to many moons ago, probably the majority of the opportunities that we have to apply for a role are generally online. So whilst we may still have some in-person opportunities to deliver a physical cover letter and resume, the majority of opportunities now come to us and are presented to us online. It's very important to remember that a lot of these application platforms really don't allow for a lot of formatting. So when writing your cover letter and your resume, it's best to keep that KISS theory, that keep it simple, stupid theory. So no photographs, very minimal formatting, no big pretty pictures and borderlines and this, that, and the other. Try and keep it as simple as possible, because quite often what happens is when you submit your application, the platform won't allow for the formatting, and it messes up all of the content of your cover letter and resume. And by the time it gets to the recruiter or the organisation on the other end, it's just a big mess. And of course, what are they going to do? Delete that and go on to the next person. So it's extremely important in this day and age when it comes to writing your cover letter and resume to really keep that formatting at a minimum. When you're doing an online application, as I've mentioned previously, there's generally the option to save your information and go back to it later. So I would advise to not rush through things, to give yourself plenty of time to really consider what information you're providing and how specific it is to that organisation, not to provide information that's irrelevant to the position, and give yourself some time to maybe write something, go back later, have a look at it again with fresh eyes, and make it as specific to the role and to the organisation as possible. So to really start that process long before the closing date of the position. Particularly in the blind and vision impaired space, you may have already experienced this or may experience it into the future, but often these online platforms for applying for a position online aren't overly accessible. So there's a couple of options around that. You could obviously ask a friend, a family member, a support worker, etc., to help you with your application so that it's appropriate for the platform. Or the other option, again, is to contact the organisation or the HR department and let them know very politely that you're interested in the position. However, the platform that they're using isn't overly accessible. The benefit to doing that is obviously that they may not have been aware that the platform isn't accessible to people with a disability, and it might actually prompt them to do something about that. But it also might provide you with an opportunity to apply in a different way. So if the organisation knows or is being made aware of the fact that the platform is not overly accessible to people that are blind or vision impaired, they may provide you with an opportunity to apply in a different way. This may be providing your cover letter and resume through an email. Prior to making that phone call, though, I would implore most people to ask a friend, family member, or sighted support worker to help you through that process, because obviously if you call the organisation, you are then again opening yourself up to the possibility of having to disclose your vision impairment or blindness, which is something that obviously we'll cover in the following workshop. Regardless of whether the platform is accessible or not, and as we do even at BCA with each other, it's always an idea that anything that you're submitting to an employer, that you have somebody read over it to check for things like grammatical errors, spelling errors, punctuation errors, formatting errors. Just have somebody have a look over it. You always want to make sure that when you're applying for something that it reads very professionally, that it's very straight to the point, that it's easy to understand. And quite often, I know for myself, even with my own work, when you're constantly reading something all the time and it's always in front of you, after a while you start to not notice things. So it's always a good idea to get a fresh pair of eyes on that, to have a look at it, and just to make sure that everything's tickety-boo and up to scratch before you actually submit your application. So that's pretty much covering writing your cover letter. Naturally, we would then move on to your resume. Your resume is obviously a lot more involved than your cover letter. As we covered, your cover letter is very straight to the point, is really specific to the role that you're applying for, and covers the specific the criteria for that position. Whereas your resume is an overall indication of who you are, what you've done, what your qualifications are, any achievements that you've reached. So it's far more in depth. So the idea is that the cover letter gives the employer a quick flash shot, if you like, of whether or not you are suitable and have the skill sets for that role. If your cover letter fulfills that expectation, then obviously you are inviting the recruiter or the organisation to then move on to your resume and read your skill sets in more detail. So when it comes to a resume, there's certainly more than one way to skin a cat. So when it comes to the way that I format resumes myself and how we provide advice around, our resume template for an eye to the future, we use one that's quite generic and seems to work. But again, the same with your cover letter, you do need to make sure that you are going through your resume, that it's not a generic resume that you provide to every employer, recruiter, that you are actually going through it every single time and making sure you're not providing information that's irrelevant, and that it's the most relevant information you can provide for that position. So with your resume, you really want to grab the recruiter's attention. Again, really try to avoid that generic language. I'm motivated, I'm hardworking, I'm this and that. Anybody can say it. It doesn't really mean anything. So really try and personalize it. It needs to be concise. It needs to be clean looking and readable. It needs to articulate your career story, your background career story, and explain why you're uniquely positioned to deliver value to that organisation in a way that other candidates can't. So really, like your cover letter, your resume is a marketing product to sell yourself to an organisation. The common misconception is that your resume is just a list of job experiences and a summary of your skills. That doesn't sell anybody. Anybody can write that. So it's really important to tailor your resume to the position that you are applying for. It's not the same as lying. Tweaking your resume is about showing the employer evidence that you are qualified and experienced enough to fulfill that role. So an example that I would give of that is if you went on a holiday and multiple people asked you how you enjoyed your holiday, the response that you give your grandmother, the response that you give a friend, the response that you give a boss might be very different, because you tailor that information based on the person that's asking. It's the same for your cover letter. It's the same for your resume. You want to tailor it for the audience and sell yourself in the best way that you can. So one of the biggest things that I would recommend is to exclude irrelevant information. If you had a position 20 years ago in, say you were selling shoes, and it was 20 years ago and you were applying for a position, again, I'll use the same example, as a secretary. How relevant is selling shoes to a secretarial position? If you've had 20 different positions over 20 years, how long is your resume going to be? Is all of that information relevant to the position that you're applying for? So I would recommend really going through it and making it as easily readable and relevant as possible, and removing some of the information that's not relevant. Important notes when it comes to information that is relevant: your resume must include your full name. It must include your contact details, so your mobile phone number. And please always try and have a professional voice message, because of course, if an employer or recruiter tries to contact you and the message is, "Hey, you've called Renee, I'm not here because I'm out drinking," doesn't sound very good. So really consider your voicemail message in case that phone call is is missed. And do make sure it's appropriate for a professional space. So if your email is, partygirl222.hotmail or at Hotmail, I would consider maybe changing that address to have on your resume. If you've got a LinkedIn profile, it's an idea to share that on your resume, and all of that contact information should be at the top, front center of your resume. Information it is not necessary to include, and actually sometimes if you do include it, can actually put recruiters and organisations in a difficult position when it comes to discrimination. So it's something to really pay attention to. It is not necessary to include your gender. It's not necessary to include your date of birth or your age, your full address, your disability status. None of this information is relevant to your capacity to fulfill a role, so it has no place in your resume. And if you provide any or all of this information, it can put recruiters and organisations into a difficult position where they don't know whether to consider the application because it's walking on the edge of discrimination. So your best bet is to always leave out that information because it's not relevant to your capacity. The information in your resume should be specific to your ability to do the job that you're applying for. As I mentioned earlier, if you wish to disclose your disability status, it's certainly up to you. But I know that we'll be covering that in further detail in our next workshop, so I hope you come along to that. When it comes to your resume, I always recommend starting off with a really good personal summary. This is generally a very short paragraph, remembering that, as I said, your cover letter and your resume are marketing materials. You are marketing yourself to the recruiter, you're selling yourself. So you want to make sure that you stand out to the next person. You want to be remembered. And when recruiters and organisations are hiring, they don't just want to know what you can do and what you're qualified to do. They want to know who you are. And that's why I always recommend starting with a personal summary. This gives you an opportunity to start with a little bit about your professional position, but then to also have a chat a little bit about who you are. So the personal summary is usually the section that helps a recruiter make that decision about whether or not you're going to fit the organisation's culture, and gives them an idea into what life looks like for you and who you are as a person. That way, you're not just words on a page, you're standing out. This is who I am, I'm a person. So it works in your resume profile to answer that classic interview question, tell me about yourself. The personal summary is your chance to really stand out above others. And as I said, should be just a short paragraph at the top of your document underneath your personal details. So start with a resume summary sentence that gives the recruiter a clear indication of your skill set. And as I said, recently, stay clear of generic language and broad statements. So a wrong way to start your personal summary or your resume summary within your personal summary is to say something like, I'm highly motivated, passionate, hardworking, I have 10 years experience working in administration, and I take pride in my work. That could be anybody from Donald Trump to the local bakery assistant. It doesn't mean anything to a recruiter, and you can't provide any evidence that you're highly motivated. You can't provide any evidence that you're hardworking. So it's irrelevant information and has no place in your resume. A good example of applying for that position would sound something along the lines of, managing office administration for 10 years, I specialise in all areas of this space, from accounts receivable, payable, reconciliation and payroll, to record keeping, providing personalised support to the leadership team, and all other office-related duties. It's very specific to the role that you're applying for, and the rest of your resume will provide evidence to support those claims. So really stay away from that generic language. The next part of your personal summary should tell the recruiter a little bit about who you are, such as things that you value and that you enjoy. So, for example, you could say something along the lines of, in my personal life, I enjoy reading autobiographies. I'm heavily involved in our local Scouts group and I have a passion for travel. The extent of my travels has given me a well-rounded perspective of the world and the people in it. As a result of this, I'm confident amongst any demographic of people and really enjoy learning about different experiences and cultures. Again, this is not generic language, it's specific to who you are and gives the recruiter some insight into the person that they're communicating with, the person they're reading about. These are the kind of details that make you pop off the screen and you're not just words on a page. It gives them an idea about what kind of person they're going to meet and what sort of cultural value that you might bring to the organisation. With respect to the body of the resume, there's plenty of ways that you can format your resume and plenty of ways that they work. So I'll go through the formatting that or the layout that I generally recommend. It's certainly worked for me and it's working for our candidates. So as I said, I generally start off with the personal summary, which I've already been through. After that, I like to list personal achievements, again, because it makes you stand out. So all the things that make you stand out above somebody else, I would start at the top of my resume. So with personal achievements, you can list any rewards or recognitions that you've achieved, whether they're personal or through the professional space. You might have received a, achievement award through a volunteering role, something like that, or won awards, a sales award it might be through your work, but it's not limited to achievements in a professional space. You may have been out of the employment space for 15, 20 years raising children. Well, raising children comes with a lot of experience that might be transferable to the role. So if you believe that you have relevant experience, particularly, say, for instance, you might have a child with a disability that you've been advocating for years. If that experience is relevant to the role, then absolutely put it under personal achievements. Also in that sector, that section, don't be afraid to be a little bit jovial, particularly if the personal achievement isn't from a professional space. Again, this is an opportunity for you to stand out from the next person. So obviously it needs to stay professional, but if you can personalise it, use slightly jovial language around something that has been gained through personal experience, then again, it will make you stand out. Just be aware that your language needs to stay professional. After that, I generally advise that you go through to your professional experience. Try not to make things too wordy. Again, you want to keep things very straightforward, very simple, easy to understand, easy to read, and very professional in its language. So I generally start off with the official job title. So as an example, I would start with project officer. That's my job title. And I work in a project position, so an I to the future comes after that. Under the job title, you put the date in which you were employed in that position. So for me right now, it would be current, or if it was a previous position, month and year to month and year. Under that, you can choose to put a small description about the organisation. So for me, it would be Blind Citizens Australia is the Australian representative or peak body for people that are blind or vision impaired. Very short, succinct, gives them an idea of what organisation you were working for. We would then follow that by key responsibilities in dot form. So it might be dot designing this, writing this, providing this, managing this, building this, reporting this, for example. In each line of those dots, try not to use the same starting word. Be a little bit creative and make sure that you keep the explanation of those key responsibilities very short and try to make them relevant to the role that you're actually applying for. At the end of each role, I like to put a little segment with achievements. So for instance, if you were running a project, or let's just go back to that administration example that I was using previously. You might have been in charge of petty cash, and may have noticed within that role that you were spending a lot of money on particular items through petty cash, and figured out a way to make that more cost effective for the organisation. This is the section under achievements where you would write anything that you had done to make that role more efficient, or evolve that role into something that was more cost effective or efficient for the organisation that you were working for. Once you've finished with your employment history or professional experience, we would then list our education and professional development. So in here, you would write what level of high school you got to, any secondary qualifications you might have, whether that be through TAFE or a university, or even a professional development course, even if it was attending a parenting, a parenting course or something like that. If it's related to the position that you're applying for, this is where that would be. Very much like your education history, you would start with the name of the organisation, what the name of the qualification or the professional development was, so the title, and then what was covered in that qualification or professional development session. Once that is finished, you would move on to certifications. So certifications might cover things like a working with children check, a first aid certificate, a national police clearance, etc. So again, it's very important to read the essential criteria of the position to make sure that you hold the necessary certifications. Again, this is another reason why it's very important to make sure that you start this application process long before the closing date, so that if there are things that you need to provide, like proof of working with children, like proof of first aid, that you actually have time to accomplish that and add that to your resume before providing those certificates through the online application process. Once you're done with that, it's a little bit debatable these days about having referees on your resume, because in general practice these days, if you impress the employer with your cover letter and resume, referees will generally be called after an interview. So that's changed a little bit. I don't think there's anything negative about including referees. Whether or not they're necessary is debatable. I still put them in my resume template, and you would generally start with the name of the person, followed by their job title, followed by the organisation that they worked for, and a contact number. Please make sure whatever referee that you decide to put in your resume, that they're aware that they're on your resume. And I would suggest that every time you apply for a position, that you let the referees know on your resume that they may be receiving a phone call. Lastly, before we go to some important notes, the most important thing with your resume, and I have mentioned it before, and your cover letter, is to make sure that it's professional. Keep any irrelevant information out of this paperwork. The more direct you can be with providing the necessary information, the more likely you will be to find success in getting an interview or getting a call back from the organisation. As you can probably assume, being in a recruiter's role, when you're getting multiple applications for a position or multiple applications for multiple positions, the last thing that you want is pages and pages and pages of information to read through. And sometimes that can be the downfall. If there's too much information and it's too wordy, sometimes your application can be put to the side and they go on to the next one. So make sure the information is relevant, it's straight to the point, it's professionally written, it's easy to read, there's minimal formatting, and that you're keeping the information extremely specific to the role that you're applying for. So in conclusion, before we open up to get some feedback from Lisa, your resume is as important as your passport or your birth certificate when it comes to searching for work. So it's really, really important that you spend a lot of time going over and over your cover letters, going over and over your resume to make sure that you've covered what I've just said. And I do recommend always having a fresh set of eyes, having a look at your documentation to get some feedback around grammar, punctuation, language, and really focusing on trying to use that industry language that's used in the job advertisement within your cover letter and your resume, and also making sure that you're not replicating language from one of those documents to the other. So with that in mind, I will open it up to Lisa now, and thank Lisa very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Renee, and thanks for having me, everyone. I have a whole list of things, and a lot of them have been mentioned by Renee, so I'll try, and I'm just mindful of time. But just to say, I'd also just like to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung and the Tanarong people, and pay respect to their elders, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. Shout out to any Aboriginal people who are on the call today. We had talked a little bit about industry jargon, which I won't go through. I won't give you a list of recruitment jargon or specific industry jargon, but if there were any questions, I'm happy to answer them later. I guess I would sort of just note that the recruitment industry, you know, does have a lot of work to do to become more accessible and also to write ads that make sense to the general public. So apologies on behalf of all of us HR and recruitment people out there. A couple of points just around looking at ads and reading them in preparation for your cover letter and your resume is just to note that titles don't always reflect the role. So read the in-depth ad, read as much information as you can about the role. Recruiters will kind of make jobs sound fancier sometimes with their titles, and just really be clear about the role that you're looking for and if it's the right one for you. Ads are also sometimes written like a wish list. I'm sure you've all seen jokes or heard of jokes, 10 years of experience for entry-level roles and that kind of expectation. So just to note that recruiters aren't realistic. They write these big long lists of all the experience they want, but in reality, that's not always the case. So I would say give the recruiter a call, ask some questions and find out a little bit more about the role. And I guess also just to note that if you don't understand the jargon or the acronyms or the words in recruitment ads, that's lazy recruitment. That's not on you. Don't let that stop you from applying for roles, because it's lazy recruitment and it happens all the time. Let's say. Guess there was just another point I'd make there, just about where possible is to make the recruitment agency your friend. So when there are roles that are advertised through a recruiter, through an agency, it's a lot easier to get good, truthful information from a recruiter than it is directly from an employer. So where there are opportunities to talk to a recruiter, I'd really recommend making that call. And even if that doesn't lead to the role this time around, it could put you in the frame for a role in the future. So I just had a list of do's and don'ts, and as I said, a lot of these have been covered by Renee, so I will sort of just jump through them quickly. And it is generic advice, and every role is different, and every type of role that you're looking for will potentially require a different application process. My first was do follow Renee's advice. Recruiters spend a very small amount of time on your resume before they decide whether to progress your resume or not through to the next part of the process. So being succinct, being concise, being really, making your resume stand out is really important in getting yourself noticed. I'd also say follow the application process to the letter. So if they are asking you to complete key selection criteria, which is the most antiquated process in the recruitment industry, but if they do ask you to do it, then you should do it. If they ask you to do a cover letter of no more than a page, then make sure you keep it limited to a page, because it really does stand out to recruiters if you haven't engaged thoroughly in that recruitment process and followed the requirements. I think we mentioned tailoring your resume. I'd add apply as soon as you can. So definitely pay attention to that closing dates, because ads will come down very quickly, but also apply as soon as you can, because some employers will, they won't wait for the close date before they start engaging with candidates and before they start looking at the resumes. So yeah, as soon as you can, spend the time on it, but as soon as you're ready, get it through. Also, don't use jargon or acronyms from your current or previous industry, noting that if it's a different industry, they don't necessarily translate. Use language that everybody will understand. Hard for some, I would say, make sure you do talk yourself up. The skills and experience that you bring are unique to you, and they deserve the attention of the recruiter. And it's really hard. It is really hard to do, but it is your moment, and it is your small little window to really, show a recruiter who you are. I'd also say ensure that there aren't any inconsistencies between your resume and your LinkedIn profile. I think Renee mentioned to maybe put a link on your resume, which is a great idea. So just make sure that, things like you get the title right on both LinkedIn and your resume, and that they don't need to be carbon copies of each other. That's not the point of LinkedIn, but they do need to be consistent and you don't want it to look like you're being untruthful in your resume. I'd reiterate Renee's point around doing your research, and also do your research to make sure it's the right employer for you. And referees, I think Renee's point was right. I don't think it matters a lot about referees on your resume, but I would say they are really important. It's always preferable for you to have a manager, somebody you've reported to in the past, as your referee, and also be comfortable what they will say about you. So if if they're asked the dreaded strengths and weaknesses question, have a bit of a yarn to them and find out what they might say in that answer. Not to ask them to not be truthful, but just so you can reflect that in any interview or what have you that you might have at a later date. Really important that consistency is far more important than the fact that people might have some weaknesses, which we all do. My don'ts were, so don't tell a recruiter your current salary. If you happen to be in that in interaction with recruiters, or if you're calling them to ask them questions, it's none of their business. Instead, talk about your expectations, and if possible, ask them what the range of the role is, if that's not in the ad. Don't be afraid to make the call and reach out to the recruiter. It is, as I mentioned, it's easier if it is an agency, but I'd also say have some smart questions. Don't call and ask questions that can be found in the ad. ask questions that you can't, that aren't publicly available. I think Renee mentioned, don't be afraid to show them a little bit of yourself, a little humour, a little personality in your resume. I think that's brilliant advice. And yeah, as someone who's read a lot of resumes, they really do stand out when you see a little bit of a spark of somebody's personality. Don't misrepresent your experience, of course. Also don't mention, and I do this, and I'm working on not doing it, is don't tell people what experience you don't have. And it's easy to do this when you're being asked to address the key selection criteria. It'll say experience in, XYZ, and you might start to answer it, well, I don't have experience in, or I haven't really done this, or what have you. Don't do that. That will, any lack of experience that you have will come out through an interview process or what have you. But, quite often, as I mentioned before, the experience that recruiters say they want is quite often a wish list, and you don't know what the other pool of candidates you're up against are, and they won't necessarily have the experience either. So best not to highlight it. But also don't misrepresent. And I guess I'd also say don't let setbacks, I guess, mess with your confidence. Most recruiters don't really care that much about the candidate experience. I shouldn't say that, but they're not really invested in their candidates. And I think that can quite often make it a very unpleasant experience when you're applying for roles and you don't even hear anything back, let alone get a rejection letter. I think it is worth following up, particularly if it's a job that you really, really wanted or you really thought you were qualified for. I really think it is worth giving the recruiter a call, reaching out to them and asking for some feedback in a diplomatic, respectful way, of course. But and sometimes they won't give you much. Sometimes they will get a little worried about, not wanting to be seen to be discriminating or what have you. But sometimes you'll get some really valuable feedback about the way your resume was structured, or that you haven't given, you haven't shown through your cover letter or your resume the skills and experience that you bring. So I would always make the call. You've sort of got nothing to lose. Yeah, so I think that's about it, Renee, unless there was something else, anything else you wanted me to talk about?
Well, firstly, you've brought up a couple of things that I hadn't thought of, which I think were really relevant. For a start, if you're dealing with, so quite often you can have the opportunity to sign up with a recruitment agency that will keep your resume on file, and if positions come up that they believe you're suitable for, you'll be contacted. So I think it's a really relevant point that Lisa brought up, to try and build that relationship with that employment consultant, with that HR person, that recruitment, that recruiter. And in doing that, not to bug them all the time, but if you've applied for a position, I think it shows great initiative that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, but if you are unsuccessful in an interview, and as most of the people know here, for every 10 doors you knock on, you might get one person respond to you. So that's just the reality of the job market. But I do think that it's a really relevant point that if you are unsuccessful in a position that you really wanted, to pick up the phone, and whether it's an HR person from a recruitment agency or the organisation themselves, is just to give them a call and politely ask for some feedback. So, what was it about your application that didn't strike them? And, in my personal experience, for the most part, you'll generally get quite honest feedback, and you can use that to inform your cover letter and your resume, your application for the next position that you move towards. I know we're going to Q&A right now for this section, but I've actually got a question myself for you, Lisa. If you're a person that's new to the job market, we were talking about putting our referees on a resume. So if you're new to the job market or possibly have been out of employment for, you know, say 15 years or something because you were raising children and you have no contact with your employers, you know, prior to that, is it worth putting in a personal referee or just leaving that completely blank in your resume?
Look, that's a really good question, and I unfortunately, particularly where you've been out of the job market for a lot of years, I do think that there's still a stigma to that, as opposed to, you know, somebody who has just left high school and maybe hasn't had that, you know, hasn't had any because of, you know, been studying or what have you. I would be looking for, you know, if you've done volunteer work, or if you know, if you're in, you know, if you're part of community kind of networks, so sporting clubs or you know, other kind of social interest kind of groups, or if you participate in focus groups, or if you you know, if anything that you're doing that is you know, kind of connects you in with people who are who do have professional roles, I think that would be the preference, you know, rather than saying, you know, this is my friend, she's known me for 20 years and she knows I'm awesome.
Yeah, so you're not going to put
true.
Not going to put your mum in there.
Yeah, not your mum or your best friend, but I do think it worth. Yeah, if you can find, if you have people around you that know you and know of you in some capacity, even if it's unpaid kind of places, I would definitely put them in. Personally, I would, you know, I would own the gap in employment as well. It's, you know, it kind of is what it is. So.
And I think it's true, wouldn't you agree, that whether you are in paid employment or raising children or volunteering, that you are still getting experience with skill sets outside of your personal life. So even if it's raising kids, for instance, and you've been out of the workforce for a long time, you still gain knowledge and experience through that experience that's relevant, that or could be relevant to the role that you're applying for. So whilst it may not be paid work or professional experience, if it's relevant to the role, that you would still put that in either your cover letter to cover the selection criteria, or in your resume to show that whilst it wasn't a paid position, you still have you know, knowledge or experience doing this through your private life. Would that be relevant in your cover letter and resume?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I learned more in my 12 months parental leave than 5 years of working and a degree. But yeah, absolutely. But I think your point around relevance would be is the point. Is you know, how do you you know, and even your lived experiences, whether it's parenting, whether it's your own personal situation, talking to your lived experience and how they have shaped, and maybe that comes more into that telling a little bit of yourself. So how your, even some of your negative experiences or some of the trials that you've been through in your life can you don't want to turn it into a sob story, of course, it's, you know, it's only a one-page cover letter, but how, you know, how you've been shaped by your experiences and your lived experiences, I think are really, they really add a richness to your resume. Little caveat there, I work for a truth-telling commission, so we're all about storytelling, so I'm all about stories. But you know, I do think you know, as a recruiter, like, resumes is so boring. And so when you get a little shimmer of someone and you see a little bit of depth and you go, wow, this person, and then that ability to translate something like that into you know, explaining to me how that will be an asset to me as an employer. It's gold, little bits of gold in a resume that will be the difference between, you know, going to the maybe file versus the no file.
I think on that topic as well, something that I didn't think to cover is positive discrimination. So some of us in the room might not have heard of that before, but there are actually positions. Positive discrimination means that, so discrimination around age, sexual orientation, gender, there are laws around it, but there are some positions, particularly in the community services space, where positive discrimination is permitted. So, for instance, if you are from the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community, there are positions, as I said, specifically in the community services sector, where they require somebody with that background. Quite often, it's also seen in the drugs and alcohol, the alcohol, drugs and other, I can't remember the name of it now, I've just had a mental blank. But in that space as well, they can also use positive discrimination. So if it comes to an advocacy role, for instance, even in the disability space, they can actually advertise under certain sections that you must have experience living with a disability, you must be from an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background, or you must have experience recovering from a mental illness or alcohol and or other drugs. That's the one that I was after. So when it comes to disclosing, again, we'll cover this in our next workshop, but there are positions that do specifically look for people with that lived experience. So quite often, often if you read the selection criteria and that positive discrimination point is there, it's really important that if you do have lived experience of recovering from a mental illness or living with a disability, etc., that you do cite that in your cover letter and or resume to the extent that you feel comfortable sharing it. But those positions where positive discrimination is part of the selection criteria, it needs to be treated as part of the selection criteria. So you do need to cover that because they're not going to hire somebody in that position that doesn't have that lived experience. So how you word it is completely up to you. How much you disclose is completely up to you before you get to an interview stage. You always need to keep that professional boundary, but if that's part of the selection criteria, it's really important that you do cover that in your cover letter.
Can I add, Renee, just on the, you know, if you haven't been in the workforce for a while, and I think probably to reiterate the point made in the earlier session, is that networking becomes, you know, that becomes your friend as well. So in addition to reaching out to recruiters and networking, and I'm a socially awkward introvert, so, you know, I'm not talking cocktail parties and corporate events, but really just, you know, at every opportunity that you get, even in your, you know, in your social life or, you know, at your, you know, in your community kind of connections or any opportunity you get to just talk to people a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what you're looking for. And because you just never know when you might come across someone who knows someone who might have something for you. You know, I'm sure there's percentages, I probably should have looked them up, but, you know, the percentage of roles that, you know, taken up before they ever make it to Seek or the other job boards is, it's phenomenal. It's a huge percentage. So, you know, I do think, yeah, like I said, it doesn't have to be at shiny corporate events. Networking comes with a kind of a view about what that is, but, you know, just talking to people, and I say that recognizing that particularly if you have been on the job hunt for a while, that's not a, you know, I'm saying it like it's an easy thing. That's not necessarily an easy thing to you know, be open like that, but you know, if you can,
it's not always what you know, it's who you know.
Yeah, if you can and you're comfortable, I would highly recommend just talk to anyone who'll listen.
Thanks, Lisa.
Renee and Lisa, thank you very much for that really comprehensive session. A lot of learnings in that for all of us. Does anyone in the room have any questions of Lisa and Renee before we move on to Tim?
Yeah, for the resume recover, you have to write, do you need an email?
Can't hear you, Renee, unfortunately.
Hello?
Oh, can hear you now. Thank you.
And this is why I don't have a job in technology. Parry, thanks for your question. I would generally say definitely. This day and age, pretty much all communication, particularly with respect to applying for positions, is done through email. I'm sure you can understand as somebody working in HR, whether it's a recruiter or through an organisation, they have multiple applications, particularly at the moment, multiple applications come through for every single position. So if you're working for an organisation or a recruiter where you're looking for to fill a placement for possibly 10 different roles, and you've got 20, 30, 40 applications coming in for every single role, picking up the phone to call every person is extremely time consuming. And so generally, the general rule these days is that you'll be contacted via email. Quite often with recruitment consultants, they might give you a call first, particularly if you've built a relationship with that person. They might give you a call first to let you know that you've been accepted for an interview, but all of the information for that interview will come through to you via an email. So yes, 100% definitely recommend that you have an email address.
Thank you for that. Can you have your hand up for a question, please?
Oh yeah, I actually have a few questions, but I don't know if we'll have time. I'll have time to ask all of them. But with the summary, the first burning question that I have, and I've had for a long time, because I graduated from university in October, and this is my first. I am just starting job seeking. With the resume summary for like graduates that have just come out of uni and that have never worked, how does that work? What do you do in that instance?
It's really just the same principle, Kana. It's a really good question. You would start off with a very short sentence about where you're at professionally, that this is what you've studied, and possibly this is the kind of work that you're aiming to get into, but just a very short sentence, because the thing is you can't narrow yourself down too far. And that's something that Maddie was saying before. When you're entering the workforce, you know, you might have this amazing qualification that you've worked so hard for, but the reality is how often you're going to step straight into that role is quite rare. So you need to not be too specific about what you're looking for. So I would recommend mentioning what you've just studied and what you're qualified in, what you loved about it. Really personalise it. Make the person see you. You're not just some student that studied this. You're Khan, and this is why you loved it. So really personalise it. So I would start by saying what you've just finished studying, why you studied it, why you're passionate about it, and then go into a little bit about what Khan's personal life looks like. So just give them a bit of a window into who you are so that you're not just words on a page. So it's not really just about having experience. That personal summary is about selling yourself and making yourself memorable to the person that's reading it. So make it about you. So not generic language. I've just studied this. This is the reason that I chose to study that. I'm very passionate about this. My end goal might be this, but it's just really about making yourself stand out to the next person. So you can include a bit of jovial language in it. You just, that part really isn't about proving what you can do. It's about showing who you are. Recruiters don't just want to know what you can do. The rest of your resume shows them that. Recruiters want to know who you are. They want to see a person, not just words on a page. So really that personal summary is just about really personalising it and making sure that that very first part of your resume is remembered and makes you stand out to the next person, experience or not.
And
Yeah, no, that's cool.
Sorry, Khan, you might actually be interested in applying for the expression of interest onto the Art of the Future project, and then you can benefit firsthand from the experience of some of the Art of the Future project officers like Renee and Maddie or Connor. So
well, I actually just have applied to the Art of the Future. I applied for it actually on Sunday.
Right. Oh, good. Brilliant.
There you go.
But this was before I got this advice, so my resume might look a bit different to what you've recommended. But
Khan, for what it's worth, that's totally fine. And that's our experience with every single expression of interest. And what we've actually got is a resume template that is in line with everything that I just spoke about. So if you've put your EOI in, your expression of interest in, I'm not sure what state you're in, but one of the project officers will be in contact with you if something.
No, that's what I'm
comes
in
up.
WA.
Oh, you're mine. I'm
Yes,
WA.
yes.
So
There you go. Wonderful.
So what will happen if something comes up that's relevant to your skill set? I'll be in contact with you, and if your resume needs work, I'll provide you with the template. It's really
Oh,
easy to follow.
fantastic. That's
No
awesome.
problem.
Because
You're welcome.
with the summary, what I've been told, and I've read different things, been told different things at uni, read different things on the internet, that if you're a graduate, you have a career